Hi, I'm Kay Caramile. I'm the grant manager for the ESRP program, and I work for the Recreation and Conservation Office.
Hey everyone, just a little video shot and then I'll turn it off to conserve bandwidth. I'm the science manager for ESRP and I'm Tish Conway-Kranis, and we are now recording this so that if anyone drops off or needs to watch it later, we will be able to do that.
Thanks, Tish. And Kay and I don't have the kind of bandwidth right now to be able to turn on our videos lest we possibly crash our side of the webinar. Jenna Jewett is our small grants and shore-friendly program coordinator, and she is not able to make it today. She's doing fine, but she also has internet troubles and is taking care of her kids this morning. So, all right, well, let's just go ahead and get started. Kay, if you can go to the next slide. All right, so I just wanted to go over the agenda real quick today. We're doing the introduction here. We'll talk a little bit about just the high-level program context and history, process-based restoration that people are familiar with, but it's the heart of our program, so we have a lot of focus on process-based restoration. We'll talk about the Restoration Protection Grants Program, the application process, the criteria. I'll go through that criteria at a high level as well, but we will go through it. We'll talk about the Small Grants Program, the purpose of that, and some of the new information about that program, funding information, and some noteworthy criteria. And then we'll talk about the Learning Program with its purpose and history criteria as well. And then we'll wrap it up with talking about how we create a investment plan for the ESRP program that brings all these program elements together. Next slide. So for those of you who don't know, I know that most folks on the phone will be familiar that ESRP is a Puget Sound-wide program that focuses on the nearshore. And that's all the way out from Neah Bay, all the way up through the whole of Puget Sound, Hood Canal, the San Juan, South Sound, excuse me, and all the way up to the Canadian border. We define the nearshore as the photic zone offshore into the intertidal area all the way up to 200 meters of the immediately adjacent uplands. And these landscapes are river deltas, beaches and bluffs, coastal inlets and embayments. Next slide. We originated from the Puget Sound Nearshore Ecosystem Restoration Project, which was a huge $22 million 15-year plus science investigation into the nearshore, defining the problems in the nearshore, process-based solutions, and then that part of the program is a partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers and is going to try to implement some large-scale restoration projects, in particular the 3 that were congressionally authorized. Well, there were 12, but they're starting off on 3. But ESRP was created in 2006 to get started on that process-based nearshore restoration and protection science, because we knew that the Army Corps partnership wasn't going to do everything that we needed to do into the nearshore, and we needed a program to get started to start working on some of these initial actions. So we've been working since then, working with developing partnerships and implementing projects. Next slide. The core team for the ESRP program really consists of, actually it's 4 people now. The program manager, our science manager, which is Tish, and the RCO grant manager, which is Kay. And now we have some new programs. We have to add a new circle there that consists of our shore-friendly and our small grants program, which is Jenna Jewett, who's our coordinator there. We also have an agency MOU team. So Fish and Wildlife, RCO, and the Puget Sound Partnership do have a memorandum of understanding to talk about how we can best partner with our 3 agencies to work together to achieve the outcomes of the program. Go ahead, next slide. So the 3 principal goals of ESRP is to secure and distribute funds to protect and restore natural processes. This is one of our strongest tactics to achieve ecosystem restoration in Puget Sound. We also work together with local and regional partners on planning and strategies to advance Puget Sound ecosystem recovery. But right now, what we're talking about is one of this, like I said, the strongest tactics that we have, which is to distribute funds through our grant process. Next slide. In addition to process-based restoration, we also believe strongly that the work that ESRP invests in also has strong outcomes in ecosystem goods and services. These are things like infrastructure improvements as we build new infrastructure that is set back from the nearshore. We have additional recreation and public benefits. We can improve drainage, and we can have strong resilience to climate change. We believe that process-based restoration is inherently a resilient action to some of those changing conditions due to climate change. Go ahead, next slide. We have 5 pathways for investing our ESRP funds. Really what we're talking about today is the 3 primary grant pathways, in addition to Shore Friendly, which is a restoration protection project, pre-design projects, which are also called learning projects, and then our small grants projects. That's what we're talking about today. Next slide. Our program funding to date has typically been around $10 million. The need has always been more than that. We are requesting a $20 million capital appropriation this year, in particular because of bringing on the very successful Shore Friendly program and trying to do more around incentives for shoreline homeowners. We are hoping to increase our appropriation above the $10 million mark. And we've done a pretty good job at leveraging some significant federal funds to date as well, totaling, I think, over $10 million now. Go ahead, next slide.
All right, that's me, everyone. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the science underpinnings of ESRP, and so go into a little bit more of our objectives as they relate to shore forms in the nearshore. So our broad goals are to restore and protect connectivity and size of large river deltas, restore and protect sediment input, transport, and accretion processes, restore and protect shoreline complexity and length, and increase understanding of natural process restoration to improve effectiveness of project actions. And that's the part of our program that we call the learning program. So as Jay mentioned, we were founded on the science of the Puget Sound Nearshore Ecosystem Restoration Project, or PSNERP, and this is just sort of a roadmap to some of the key products of that really extensive science investigation. First, looking at our guiding philosophy of restoration, and then thinking about, and sorry, I tried to minimize on the animations here because we're doing this remotely, but I can't annotate it, so you'll just have to look at it. There was a big change analysis, and that was Simonstad et al. Looking at what's changed in the nearshore. Fresh et al. Did a really nice summary of the implications of those change. There was an analysis of how future growth and development might affect the nearshore, and then an assessment of which of the changes that had been identified were problems and why, and then a really nice summary of the kinds of actions that we do to protect and restore the nearshore, and that's Clancy et al., and we call those actions management measures. Then Cherokino et al. Did some really work that's foundational to our program, where he identified what we call the management strategies across Puget Sound. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. Next slide. So as Jay mentioned, the PSNERP component of this work is now in a new phase where there's feasibility. There's a big feasibility report, and then congressional approval for 12 projects, and then now Duckabush is moving forward. And then next slide. And then the Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program is a building on this element as well. And sorry, we also have Shore Friendly that is coming. That is a new component of our program. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the key, as Jay mentioned, the key philosophical underpinning of our program is to restore processes. And this is just really recognizing the link between the ecological processes that form structure on the landscape, and then the connection to ecological function that's connected to that structure. So this is sort of at our heart and guides all of our actions. We know that this is hard, and that processes are inherently dynamic, and structure and function take time to develop. And one of the ways that our program sort of has internalized addressing these challenges is through the learning program. Next slide. So this is an example of an interconnected, functioning nearshore ecosystem where we've got a river coming down and forming a delta. There's mudflats, there's beaches. And if we look at this depiction, we can say, what are the processes that we care about? And then next slide. We can ask, what are the processes that are maintaining this physical landscape that we see? And so next slide. There are a lot of them, and in a longer version of this talk, I talk about each one of them individually, but just some of the key ones are freshwater input, sediment input and transport, accretion, erosion, channel migration and formation, and detritus is my favorite. So when we talk about restoring processes, this is the suite of processes that we think about that are maintaining the landscape in the nearshore. Next slide. So one of the key ways that PSNERP identified to think about the nearshore was to recognize that it's not all the same around Puget Sound, and that we do better to understand the differences in the landscape throughout the Sound in this nearshore environment. So they divided up the world into shore forms. So deltas are specifically the 16th largest river deltas in Puget Sound. Coastal inlets are kind of like mini deltas. Barrier embayments have a source of fresh water, but they also have some kind of spit or barrier that's being formed by sediment transport along the shore, and then beaches. Next slide. And we can think of these as being sort of with an increasing reliance on sediment supply and transport as we move from deltas to beaches, which are entirely reliant on that, and then an increasing reliance on freshwater as we move from beaches to deltas. So next slide. We can just think about these shore forms as providing maybe different sets of ecosystem services, and are certainly shaped by different combinations of these physical processes, and therefore suggest sort of a management unit scale and approach to actions. Next slide. So this is just an example of what this looks like as defined by the PSNERP project. So this is just a map of Puget Sound divided into these shore forms, and then I've kind of some of them have more specific ones. So sort of most simply the deltas, beaches, coastal inlets, and barrier embayments. Next slide. So the other really key thing that they did in the PSNERP project was to divide up the nearshore by process units. So a process unit is big. It's a linear shore form, but it's also the entire catchment area that drains into that linear slice of shoreline. It specifically also includes the adjacent upland, and there are particular kinds of data sets and analyses that really speak to that 200-meter adjacent upland area. And then shore forms, of which there can be several within a process unit. They identified over 800 of these linear shoreline process units, and then 16 of those large delta process units. And the shoreline process units are defined by net sediment drift, so going from a sediment source to an area of sediment deposition. Next slide. And so this work was done. It was finalized in 2012, and 2011, and it was done with the best available data that was sound-wide at the time. But since then, we have really been evolving our data collection and therefore our analyses. And this is a project that's nearing completion that we call Beach Strategies, and some of the data sets that have been updated are already available, and they are visible on the Coastal Atlas. And those are new data for armor, for shore forms, and for drift cells. Next slide. Next slide. So one of the really cool things that PSNERP also did was summarized all of this really great information by process unit. So for every single of those 812 shoreline process units plus the Delta process units, you can go to our interactive map, and there's a link to this in the RFP and also on the website, and get a 2-pager that summarizes the sediment dynamics, the shore forms that are present within that process unit, the level of degradation, key upland or watershed features, shoreline modifications like armor. Again, this is in the PSNERP analysis, so it doesn't include the more recent beach strategies analysis, and we're working on making an outward-facing web tool that will depict in a user-friendly way all of the new beach strategies information. But that's coming. If there's wetland, the proportion and amount of loss or gain in the last 100 years or so. And then finally, the management strategy of restore or protect or enhance. Next slide. So the management strategy document, that's Cherokino et al. Next slide. What this did was, for each of those process units, categorizing it based on data that spoke to either degradation or potential, and categorizing each of those process units in one of these 6 categories. So from increasing degradation, protect, restore, or enhance, and with increasing potential, which spoke to the size and complexity of the process unit and the potential ecosystem services that would be gained by restoration, high or regular. And so this is a really great starting place as we move around Puget Sound to understand where to start and how to guide our actions. Process units are really big, so we always understand that there is a local story and local data that can enhance and help us understand the context around these recommendations. And I've just put a box around protect and restore because these are the kinds of actions that ESRP focuses most on, where restoration of processes is possible. Next slide. So this is just what this looks like for the river delta strategy. So there's 16, and the polygons are really big because they represent the entire watershed area. And there are 6 categories, but in the river deltas, none of them were not degraded enough to have a recommendation of protect. So they're either restore or enhance. Next slide. And then this is just what that looks like for beaches, again, in the Cherokino et al. Analysis. And here you can see all 6 of the recommendations are present throughout the sound. Next slide. And again, we are so excited that our Beach Strategies project is nearing completion, and we'll have some updated kinds of recommendations. Okay, I will let Jay take it away.
Hi, thank you, Tish.
Oh yeah,
this
sorry.
is Kate Caramile. Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to talk to you about the Restoration Protection Grant. This is one of the 3 grant programs that we have open right now. I'm going to go over some of the basics, what's new, the grant competition calendar, how to apply, and then Jay's going to go over the criteria. So in order to qualify for ESRP funding, your project must restore, protect Puget Sound estuary and nearshore environment. To qualify for ESRP funding, ESRP funds acquisition projects, feasibility and design projects, construction projects, or projects that include a combination of all 3 activities. The work must occur during the award period, and that is July 1st of 2021 through June 30th of 2023. But do keep in mind that additional time may be approved if justified. There are some exceptions to the award period, and I'm going to go over a few of them. One of these is acquisitions that occur prior to your grant award with a waiver retroactivity from RCO. So what does that mean? Normally, if you were to acquire a property before your grant period starts, it would not be eligible for reimbursement or to be used as match unless you get what's called a waiver retroactivity. So what that means is you apply to RCO for approval. The RFP includes a link to the information needed to submit a request for a waiver retroactivity. That includes things such as landowner acknowledgement form, title report, appraisal. You provide that information to RCO reviews it, and will issue a letter, which is your waiver. If you receive a waiver, that waiver is good for all RCO grant programs. It's not specific to the grant program that you had in mind at the time. And it's good for 2 grant rounds. So for ESRP, it's offered every other year, so your waiver would be good for almost 4 years. For Salmon Recovery Funding Board projects, those grants are offered annually, so a waiver would only be good for 2 years in that program. If you get a waiver or if you don't get a waiver, all acquisition projects must follow the acquisition policies set by RCO, and that's in RCO Manual 3, which is also, there's a link to that in your RFP. And keep in mind that if you're awarded a waiver, that does not guarantee your funding award. It just makes your project eligible in the future. Another pre-agreement cost that's allowed are costs that are necessary to establish land values for acquisition projects. That would be your title reports, your appraisals, review appraisals, things like that. Similarly, engineering and design costs are eligible for both design projects as well as for restoration projects. And lastly, wood, culverts, and bridges are eligible if you purchase them prior to your agreement, if it's determined to be cost effective and approved prior to acquiring them. Other materials such as plants and other things, those are not eligible pre-agreement costs. And similarly, if you do any ground disturbance whatsoever, so any restoration work that you do prior to receiving an award is not eligible pre-agreement. Some ineligible project actions: ESRP does not fund mitigation, nor can mitigation be used to match ESRP funding. ESRP funds can be used to supplement mitigation, though. So if you have some required mitigation and you want to expand upon that requirement, ESRP funds can be used to do that. Indirect costs are not eligible for ESRP funds. The exception for that is the learning program. And then lastly, effectiveness monitoring is not an eligible cost for the Restoration Protection Program or the Small Grants Program. And this is a somewhat new element. So what is effectiveness monitoring? Effectiveness monitoring is basically any monitoring that you're doing to determine whether or not your project had the anticipated effect. I typically consider it to be biological monitoring, although it is not exclusive to biological monitoring. But if you're wondering, did the fish respond to the project that I just built? Did the birds respond as I anticipated? That is effectiveness monitoring and cannot be funded through the Restoration Protection Grant Program or the Small Grants Program. The reason for that is that ESRP's funding comes from state capital bond funds, and those funds must be spent on acquisition or construction or activities that directly lead to acquisition and construction. Therefore, effectiveness monitoring doesn't really fit. However, ESRP does fund the learning program, and that collects region-wide data to inform future restoration. So if you do have a project that you think might be a good candidate for focused monitoring effort in the learning program, I encourage you to talk with Tish.
Okay, can I add one small thing, if it's okay if I chime
Sure.
in? With the indirect costs, if there's a federal award associated with your grant, does that make any changes to that?
No. And if you're applying for restoration protection grants or small grant program, indirect costs are not eligible. So eligible applicants, basically anybody can apply. Federal, state, local agencies, tribes, enhancement groups, nonprofits, land trusts, conservation districts, and public or private corporations. We really don't exclude anybody. There's no minimum or maximum request. We do have a 30% match requirement, and that 30% is based on your total cost in PRISM. Keep in mind that your actual total cost may be greater than what you're showing in PRISM, but we do have a 30% match requirement based on the total project cost in PRISM. Again, the exception is the learning program. That 30% is based upon apply to match as it does to any reimbursable expense. So if it's not eligible for reimbursement, it's not eligible for match. So the ESRP program requires a 10-year stewardship commitment. Basically, we don't want you to construct a project and walk away. We really would like you to ensure long-term project success. And to do that, we do fund implementation monitoring. That's a little different than effectiveness monitoring. Implementation monitoring is your basic compliance monitoring to demonstrate that your project was completed as planned, and also to address any post-construction issues. Do you need to water the plant? Are they experiencing herbivory, or is the weed control necessary? Are your log jams falling apart? Basically, any monitoring that's necessary for you to make sure your project is holding together, that's eligible and actually required for you to do. And again, effectiveness monitoring is not eligible. Sometimes there's a very fine line and a very big gray area between implementation monitoring and effectiveness monitoring. So if you have any questions about that, by all means, talk to us, and we'll try to piecemeal things together. Permitting, you as a project applicant is responsible for all of the project permitting. Culture resource consultation is a little different. RCO is responsible for culture resource consultation if there is no role or geotechnical investigation. All of that is ground disturbance, and all of that requires consultation. But if your project has a federal nexus, so it requires a federal permit, it has federal funding, or it occurs on federal land, then that federal agency is going to take responsibility for that consultation. If you don't have a federal nexus, but your project occurs on state land, it's on Fish and Wildlife land or DNR land, that state agency is going to take the lead on the cultural resource consultation. And if none of the above applies, then RCO is responsible for that consultation. And your application in PRISM asks you a series of questions in order to help to tease out who's responsible for that consultation. And the outcome of that consultation is going to be dependent upon the amount of risk that your project poses to cultural resources. It may be that your project poses a very low risk, and so it can proceed under an inadvertent discovery plan. That means you can go ahead with your project, but if you actually uncover anything, you need to stop and notify the proper authorities. It may mean that your project poses a small risk and you'd like to have an archaeological monitor on site during certain activities. Or it may mean that the risk is unknown and a cultural resource survey is necessary prior to implementation. The results of that survey may come out saying that you need an inadvertent discovery plan, but otherwise can proceed. You may need a monitor. Or it may be that your project poses a very high risk to cultural resources and you need to modify your project design or mitigate for any impacts. And the reason I'm going into such detail on this now is that although the consultation is not your responsibility, if that consultation requires any follow-up actions such as hiring an archaeological monitor or conducting a cultural resource survey, that comes out of your project budget. So I highly encourage you to incorporate some cultural resource consultation in all of your budgets. I often recommend a $5,000 or $6,000 be set aside towards cultural resource consultation. The exact amount really depends upon your project, and if you have any questions on that, we can talk about it. Moving on to the calendar. Basically, this year's calendar has the same steps as last time. Keep in mind that we set this calendar up over a month ago, and a lot has changed in the last month. We are trying to be as flexible as we can to accommodate everybody's craziness that they're going through right now. We do have limits to how flexible we can be. We do have to have a ranked project list by September. So although we do have some flexibility within the schedule, there's not a whole lot to work with. So pre-proposals are due April 1st. Your pre-proposal requires a minimal amount of project information. If you cannot meet the April 1st deadline, please talk to Jay or I so we can determine whether an extension might be possible. We want to do this on a case-by-case basis. We would need to know by April 1st whether or not you're going to apply, and if you just need an extra week, we could probably accommodate that fine. But definitely let us know by April 1st that you're going to apply so that we need that information for the next step. Normally, the next step would be site visits. Given current travel restrictions, we're going to be switching over to webinars instead. These webinars are optional, but they are highly recommended. The webinars give an opportunity for you to present your project to ESRP staff, as well as WDFW biologists and engineers, and able to get some feedback from them to help to improve your project and to improve its competitiveness in the grant round. If you are invited to submit a final application, you'll be notified by early June at the absolute latest. And then final applications are due on July 23rd. Presentations are required and they will take place the week of August 17th to the 21st. Now the presentations are given to the folks who are actually going to be ranking your project. There may be some overlap with the folks who provided you feedback back in the spring, but there's not a lot of overlap between the two groups. So the presentations are going to be to this group. It's a chance for the reviewers to gather more information and ask you questions about your project. And after these presentations, they're going to be finishing up their ranking. We'll have a ranked list by September 2020 and offer that to state legislature. We'll get the budget sometime in the spring of 2021. At that time, we'll know how far down the list we're able to fund, and then contract start date would be July 1st of 2021. Now, the process I just went through is really for the new projects that are being proposed. We also have a portfolio process. That process is a streamlined process I'll get into in a minute. And basically, the portfolio projects do not need to participate in the pre-proposal or the site visits or the presentations, but they do have the same final application deadline of July 23rd.
Okay, I'd love to just add to what you had said with that last grant round. Yeah, like Kay had mentioned, you know, I think that, you know, we are in very challenging circumstances, and where we have the most flexibility within our timeline is in this pre-proposal early stage. I think we are going to be more efficient with our site visits when they're going to be webinars instead of driving across Puget Sound and visiting individual project sites. So I just want to encourage people that if you have some sort of a hardship where you really want to apply through the program and are struggling to reach that April 1st deadline, like Kay had mentioned, just talk to us and we'll make it work. I think we have a lot more flexibility in the earlier stages of our process in the next month or so.
Thanks. So what's a portfolio project? A portfolio project is a project in which the previous phase was ranked and funded in ESRP competition. Right now, only design and restoration projects are eligible as portfolio projects. We did get a recent request about an acquisition project, and we realized that that's not something we'd considered in the past. Although it's not eligible for this grant round, we are considering it for future grant rounds. So if you had a previous phase of design or a previous phase of construction that was funded by ESRP, and you have effectively completed that previous scope of work, your feasibility tasks are complete at the minimum, you've got a viable alternative, and you have a willing landowner, and you have not substantially altered your project scope, your project can qualify to be a portfolio project. And what that means is you qualify for a streamlined process. Why do we have portfolio projects? Well, basically, we recognize that some projects are very complex and cannot be completed between design and implementation within a single biennium or even 2 biennium. They may take a decade or more to actually get completely done on the ground. So that's why we have portfolio projects. We can fund the projects in phases, and rather than each phase having to recompete against the other projects in the grant round, you're part of the portfolio process and you can be streamlined. So how to apply? You're going to want to verify your project eligibility with Jay by April 1st. And the reason I mention April 1st is because if you do not qualify as a portfolio project, you need to compete in the grant round and have your pre-proposal in for April 1st. If you qualify as a portfolio project, you're going to need to submit your project status and budget worksheet in PRISM by the final application due date of July 23rd, and then notify us. And then the ESRP management team is going to rank and determine your award.
Okay, we just had a question from somebody. Just to remind folks, we are talking about the restoration and protection grant opportunities right now. We will go through the small grants and the learning projects later on in the presentation.
Thank you. So what's new? This applies to your new projects. This year, both your pre-proposal and your final application are going to be required to be submitted in PRISM. In the past, pre-proposals were submitted outside of PRISM via emails, but that just became very difficult to track for our part. So this year, we're requiring everything to be submitted via PRISM. Your budget and project narrative used to be an attachment in PRISM. It's now going to be incorporated into PRISM itself. That isn't yet complete, but we're in the process of making that happen, and it should be ready by the time you submit your final applications. You might see some things have been rearranged in PRISM. There's a few new questions, and we've updated the criteria, which Jay's going to get into in a minute. So the RFP provides very specific directions on how to submit your applications. I'm just going to try to go over them briefly. If you have any questions, always, by all means, give me a call. I can help walk you through it. The first step is to get a PRISM account if you don't already have one. I ask that you don't use someone else's account. It can cause problems later on in terms of who's actually is the correct project contact. So definitely get your own account. It's free and it takes just a few minutes of your time. You then want to start your application in PRISM Online. As soon as you get in PRISM Online, this is the screen you'll see. You'll click on New Application. This screen will appear. You just need to enter in your sponsoring organization. You select what grant program you're applying for. In this case, it'll either be the ESRP pre-proposal or the ESRP small grant pre-proposal. The process I'm discussing right now is actually for both small grants and regular ESRP. You'll need to select your project type. That's going to be acquisition or planning or restoration or a combination, and then give it a title. And once you're ready, you say Start New Application. At that point, you'll have a series of screens to fill out, and you just go screen by screen, enter the information, and keep clicking Next. There's 4 attachments that are required with your pre-proposal. It's a vicinity map, a site or parcel map, a draft cost estimate, and you can use any format you want with that. And then any design information that you have, whether it be a sketch, photos of what you're thinking about doing. But if you've got an entire design report and design plans, attach it all to PRISM. Don't skimp. The more information you provide, the better. So the requirements for the pre-proposal this year are the exact same as they have been in the past. There's only one difference in that there's one additional question that's asking for you to describe the problem that your project seeks to address. Otherwise, it's the exact same thing you've seen in the past. Once you finish your application, you're going to go to the Submit Application page. You're going to check the application for errors. Anything with a green check means that it's fine. If you get a red exclamation mark like you see at the bottom of the screen, that means there's something you need to address there. You go to that page, you address whatever it is. Once everything is error-free, you just submit. You certify that it's correct, and then submit the application. And again, do it by April 1st. The next stage is the site visit. And then after that, final application. So if you're invited to submit a final application, you'll receive some additional information via email, but the process is all described in the RFP. Basically, I'm going to convert your pre-proposal into a full proposal. It's going to have the exact same PRISM project number, but there will be some additional information that's required. And again, you're just going to go screen by screen, clicking next, entering the information as you go. The required attachments for a full proposal are the same as they've been in the past. There'll be a full application budget worksheet. This is going to be revised from what you've seen in the past. There's been a large body of work that's been going on to kind of across different grant programs that come up with the same budget worksheet. So we're going to be using that new budget worksheet. It looks a lot like what you've done in the past for ESRP. So you shouldn't see too big of a difference, but again, it's new. So if there's questions arise, by all means ask. Everything else is something you've seen before. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. One is the applicant resolution and authorization form. The reason I want to highlight that is because it can take some time to develop. Basically what that is your governing body must pass a resolution that authorizes submittal of the application to RCO and identifies who is authorized to sign the agreement and any amendments to that agreement. Now, this has been a requirement for 5 or 6 years with RCO. And again, it might take some time to get because it does require your governing body to pass the resolution. And if that body doesn't meet very often, you don't want to leave this to the last minute. The other thing I wanted to highlight is the Culture Resources APE map. And that is because this is what I most often have to return applications for. Your area potential effect map is used for our culture resource consultation. What we require is that it be on ideally a USGS map. It needs to be zoomed out enough that all the section lines appear, the section numbers appear, and it's really clear where you're working relative to all of that. You want to have your project name and number on there. You want the section township range listed. You can provide a more detailed map, what you see down below, to help to provide more information. But at a minimum, you need to provide the map up above because that's really what we need. So again, once you complete all the material, you'll run an error check and certify it's complete and submit your application. So Jay's now going to talk about the criteria.
Thanks, Kay. And let me just mention, we're trying to get through a lot of material here, and we do intend to have time at the end for Q&A. However, if you do have a question and you want to go ahead and type it into the chat box, that's fine. And as we get into the Q&A, we'll go through those questions and we'll try to address them. If you just need to go ahead and make sure to get that down so you don't forget your thoughts. So I'm going to go into the criteria. I'm going to have to move relatively quickly through this and keep it at a high level. And this is just to provide an overview of what our values are and how we think about what the priority projects and best ESRP projects are. We do award funds through our transparent competition. Each individual grant program has a peer review process. The portfolio projects are reviewed by our broader ESRP WDFW team, but small grants and restoration protection and then the learning regional pre-design projects all have separate review teams within each of their own unique criteria for all those different programs. And I will show you a slide at the very end of the presentation that shows how all those projects are woven together into a single investment plan because of our requirement to really submit information to the legislature that's not overly complicated so that it can give a program-wide view. So go ahead, next slide. So these next few slides are just some graphics with how we think about the process unit and the different nested elements of the ecosystem. Our ecosystem is really complex. When we look at our program at a Salish Sea or at a Puget Sound level, we have these different components where we can break up the ecosystem into different parts. And I think that helps us with thinking about our different regional, go ahead and click, Kay, the different ecosystem recovery goals that are more at that larger regional, sub-basin, or management area scale. And those all point towards trying to initiate actions that try to address those ecosystem recovery goals at those larger scales. Next slide. The process unit, what we've talked about quite a bit, is a really important scale. We think about the process unit like a river reach, an area of the ecosystem that is large, where we can have a broad effect. We can think about processes, where we can consider how individual habitat types and the parcel can be impact the sustainability and on the process unit itself. Go ahead, next slide. So our best projects do restore or protect a high diversity of those processes at that process unit scale. Next slide. So actions at that parcel scale can recover process unit degradation. We think a lot about when you're trying to initiate a project action at the parcel scale, how can it most be effective at that process unit scale in regards to sediment supply, sediment transports, forestation, tidal flow, and freshwater inputs. And like Tish had mentioned earlier on, we really focus on the protect and restore elements within this particular part of our grant program. Next slide. So all restoration does depend on protection, and we are trying to recover what has been lost in the ecosystem, and we cannot do that unless we protect what's intact. Go ahead, next slide. And because of that, we try to ask you, and as it relates to your project, to account for future risks. Those future risks could be development, population growth, different potential things that may occur that will impact the sustainability to your project restoring process. Go ahead, next slide. We also prioritize process units that sustain large complex systems. So within an individual process unit, there's many types of habitats, or there could be many types of habitats, and many individual parcels within those process units. So how does your project, or how can projects really address multiple habitat types, or potentially multiple habitat types, and build back more of the complexity within those systems? Next slide. So our criteria try to get at those things in four primary categories of ecological importance, technical merit and readiness, cost justification, and public support and involvement. I put 2 asterisks by 2 of the criteria categories where we have made some changes to the points. So we have added 5 points to the technical merit and readiness and 5 points to the public support and involvement, and I'll show you where those points have been added and why. Next slide. So I'm going to go through this really quickly, and it's really to frame your questions and see if you have any thoughts or considerations as it relates to your project, either now or during the site visit. So the first question under ecological importance is, does the project have a large effect on a delta or shoreline process unit? Again, this is looking at your project footprints, and does that project have a strong impact outside of the project area onto the process unit? Go ahead, next slide. Will the site itself be resilient to future degradation? So thinking about that, this project will result in a highly functioning site that restores or protects those ecosystem dynamics and connectivity. And if it's not delivered fully by the individual project action that you're proposing now, the proposal describes how incremental work could reach a target condition at the site scale. And I'll note here that one slight tweak that we've made to our criteria, in the past, we've asked you to withhold your discussion or your dialogue about climate change into a future question. But really, we see like there's so much interconnectivity between things that are happening, changing climate conditions, and the project that we still have that separate question, but we're also saying like it's great to still talk about any sort of climate change relevant information within this question itself. Next slide. And then do the surrounding conditions support the project? So that's looking outside of the project site, the scale of the parcel or your project area footprint itself, thinking about the surrounding conditions. And will those surrounding conditions, thinking about the future scenarios or the future developments or the protection of the surrounding area, how does that either protect or add value to the project actions that you have themselves? Go ahead, next slide. Does it provide ecosystem services that benefit society? We've changed the wording on this question a little bit, and it's really trying to think about what we talked about before is the that we invest a lot of time and funding into projects, and we believe we understand that there are some strong benefits for society. So asking you to articulate those things. Go ahead, next slide. Now in the technical merit and readiness category, asking about the techniques and if they're reliable and likely to have the desired outcomes. So really being thoughtful about what are the outcomes that you're proposing, and do you have the techniques that that we know can achieve those outcomes. Go ahead, next slide. Have you identified a strategy for addressing or resolving uncertainty around your project? So we know that uncertainty is out there. We're currently living in uncertainty right now. So we want people to be clear-eyed and address that uncertainty. The more knowledgeable that we can be about maybe the known unknown, or a plan for addressing the unknown unknown, is a really important component of projects. But realizing that things can change and making sure that the project proponents and the project is able to be nimble to those changing conditions so that we can achieve the outcomes that we hope. One thing that we did add to this criterion is large scale is at the very end of this page here. Large scale projects and or those with high uncertainty have identified specific learning objectives or have created or will create a learning and adaptive management plan together with the ESRP Nearshore Science Manager. The plan will identify hypothetical connections between implementation monitoring findings and potential future considerations. This is brand new for us. We haven't done this before, so we'd really like you to think about this. If you have a large-scale project, so as Kay had talked about, that we do fund implementation monitoring in these 10-year plans to monitor the conditions that are happening at your sites. What we'd like to do is have some sort of a small document that identifies some of those potential things to watch for, and so that we can have a stronger opportunity to support adaptive management project actions in the future. So go ahead, next slide. Is the project designed to be resilient to climate change, and or does it promote ecosystem resilience in the face of climate change? So this used to be 5 points. And we believe strongly that climate change is something we need to do a better job at addressing and put more of an emphasis on. So we added additional points to this individual criterion to reflect that. Go ahead, next slide. And is the project ready to go? So that is really, what are the barriers that could be preventing your project from being able to be implemented? That could be permitting, that could be access to land, and that could be social barriers. So we articulated a little bit the social barriers elements at that very last bullet. Go ahead, next slide. Cost justification, we made a few changes to cost justification. We didn't increase the points, but we did split up this first question, and then the next question on the next page have been split up. So the first one is getting at, are the actions appropriate for the site? The way I think about this is, if you've ever bought a home, homes are valued based on surrounding homes that are like yours and what their valuation is. So if you're in Seattle, you have a 2 or 3 bedroom house, it's going to be like $1 million. But if you're in Olympia, your 2 or 3 bedroom house is going to be $200,000 to $300,000. So very different depending on where you are and what kinds of surrounding project types reflect the costs of your project. So we realize that projects along the railroad are going to be more expensive, and some projects that are in a different part of Puget Sound are going to be less expensive. So making sure that they're appropriate. So go ahead, next slide. And then we split that up. We took out this portion. Really what had been happening over the last few years is the cost benefit was being muddled with the appropriate comparable costs. So we took that out. We split it into 5 and 5 points. And then this next one is this have a high cost benefit? So if you're implementing a project, we have limited funds to spend across Puget Sound within the Nearshore. Is this the best bang for our buck kind of a category? And then the last one in the cost category, is there a clear and understandable budget? Go ahead, next slide. And the last one that we did make some changes to is the stakeholder support and involvement. Again, talking about those social benefits, the benefits to local communities, and where we added some points to and some clarity to was on number 2. Are there the appropriate level of stakeholders and partners involved? Some projects may be small and don't need a huge amount of public outreach, but they all need some. They need the appropriate amounts. Some large projects need a lot more stakeholder support and involvement. And in particular, this last bullet is trying to articulate the need for some of these larger projects. If we're going to achieve some of the ecosystem recovery goals that we have in the Puget Sound Nearshore, in our deltas, and around the shorelines, some of these large projects do affect a broad spectrum of stakeholders, tribes, and others. So we want to make sure that you have a really good public engagement strategy to both overcome obstacles and to identify multi-benefit opportunities. Not that ESRP is funding all of those multi-benefit opportunities, but ESRP's ecosystem restoration goals and process-based restoration goals do fit within a larger planning context for a larger project. So we want to try to push people and reward people for doing that legwork. Next slide. So we have a lot of other resources that are available. Here's a smattering of some. These are at the very end of the RFP. We have connections, links, and web addresses for all of these things in the end of the RFP. But here's just a bunch of different resources for you. In particular, there's 2 new ones that we haven't talked about. There's a white paper that was put together by a number of folks, some folks that are on this line as well. The Puget Sound Nearshore Chinook Salmon Strategies, and then the sea level rise considerations for nearshore restoration projects in Puget Sound. Those are 2 pretty new publications that have come out just in the last few years. So, and go ahead, next slide. All right, this is me too. So Jenna couldn't be here. I want to just talk a little bit about our small grants program. And again, if you have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box and we'll get to those at the very end. So I'll go through this too. So we've been implementing a small grants program pilot project for 2 biennia, and I think we're honing in on more of a robust vision for the small grants program. We're going to be investing in the 21-23 biennium. We want to engage with local communities to find solutions to complex problems. One of the things that we want to do more of with these small projects is to have them be demonstration projects. Smaller investments, they are going to be targeted on our beach systems primarily, and we want to really carve off some cash from the ESRP program so we can continue to do these small community-based beach and armor restoration projects that are locally important. Go ahead, next slide. Projects are eligible to receive awards between $30,000 and $150,000. And we don't want these to be small investments in large projects, but we want these to be small projects. So total project costs of less than $500,000, and the ESRP funds eligible for that project is between $30,000 and $150,000. These are guidelines for us to try to keep the scope of the program appropriate. And just like Kay had said, it's between 2021 and 2023, same biennial grant period. And we will dedicate at least $500,000 for small grants. If we get a larger appropriation, we hope that it can be some more, but we have to be thoughtful depending on what the ESRP gets in the capital budget. Next slide. We want projects to be endorsed by at least one of the following local nearshore organizations, so MRCs, lead entities, LIOs, a local shore-friendly sponsor, and to have a letter of support by one of these organizations. And we want to make sure that because we want to do demonstration sites, engage with local communities, that you have a communication plan. It doesn't have to be a big complex thing, but we will have that be a deliverable if you're awarded funding. Go ahead, next slide. And again, similar schedule. The pre-proposals for this are due later, April 15th. There are optional site visits, which are really webinars this year. Final applications due on the 25th, and we will do some sponsor presentations towards the end of July for a final ranking in September. Next slide. All right, we're getting close, and hopefully we can get through our learning program and still leave about 15 minutes for any Q&A.
Yep. Before we move on, Jay, Katrinka has a question about does shore-friendly funding for project design, can that count towards the 30% match funding for small grants?
So yeah, go ahead, Kay.
ESRP funds cannot be used to match ESRP funds, so no. The short answer would be no, that the shore-friendly funding cannot be used to match the small grant.
So yeah, that's something we could talk about if there's other funding through your shore-friendly program, or if there's some federal funding that we might be able to match. So yeah, we can try to work with you on that question. We want to make it happen, but it is true you can't use the same program to match themselves if they're both state ESRP monies.
Okay, so we're going to switch gears now and talk about the learning program. We'll talk about purpose, history, criteria, and objectives, and what the part of our program that the learning program addresses is our goal to increase understanding of natural process restoration and improve the effectiveness of our project actions. Next slide. So we have a different process from the small grants and the restoration and production side of our program. As some of you guys have noted, we have a different timeline and a different RFP. So we have a technical review that consists of sometimes overlapping, but not necessarily technical with the restoration and production reviewers, a set of reviewers. We get a ranked list, and the funding that can go to fund learning projects is 10% of the total ESRP appropriation. And the way this fits into a capital budget request is thinking about these projects as regional feasibility and pre-design. So really analyses and work that can inform and improve the effectiveness of the next project, the next generation of projects. Next slide. So our timeline is we give a little more time for the pre-proposals. They're due on the 27th of April. And these are fairly simple, and they're just emailed to me. They're not in Prism yet. Then on the 20th of May is when we intend to send out invitations to submit a full proposal. And then this is a little bit of a modification from the process last year. Here, our plan is to invite, obviously, virtual presentations to occur for those proposals that are invited to submit full proposals in June, and basically allow project sponsors to incorporate feedback and comments from those presentations into their full proposals that will be due in August. So that's we're always trying to iterate and improve our process, and so that's our innovation for this year. And then like the rest of the grants, we expect a notification for a place on a ranked list sometime in September. Next slide. So we have some basic criteria for the learning program or learning projects, and we want the project to be important in that it addresses the questions that are most limiting for restoration or addressing uncertainties. We want the projects to be efficient and have methods that we know will work. We want to see projects that have a high policy impact, so can inform capital restoration programs like us as far as policies and guidance. And then we look for projects that are transferable. So we give points to projects that can address questions that affect multiple or broader landscapes. And each of those 1 through 4 is worth 10 points, and then learning priorities is 5 points, and that it addresses our stated program objectives, our learning priorities. Oh, next slide. And so we have these broken down by shore forms. So we have a few for Delta, looking at Delta scale analyses of function or resilience, projects that speak to specific kinds of design decisions for levee removal, and then how we might go about planning for projects that have multiple benefits. For beaches, we're always looking for analyses that can help identify beach targets as far as restoration or protection, as well as any innovative methods that can help us protect sediment supply. For embayments, and any work that can speak to the mapping or characterization of Puget Sound embayments, we think would help, and then also that allow us to understand and predict fish rearing. Next slide. So in general, learning projects have fallen into kind of 3 major buckets. They have tended to be field investigations of an ecosystem response to restoration actions to help us better plan for future restoration. Analyses that are intended to maximize the benefits, ecosystem benefits for restoration planning, and then predictive models of important ecosystem processes that we know are really relevant for restoration. So things like sediment transport and channel development. Next slide. And then just some examples of the projects that we funded or are funding. So for beaches, we've had projects looking at the effects of armor removal and beach nourishment along the railroad, analyses for restoration planning looking at variation in bluff erosion rate around Puget Sound, identifying target beaches and for restoration and protection, that's the Beach Strategies Project, and then looking at the quantity and volume of feeder bluff sediment supply. Next slide. And then for river deltas, we've had several projects looking at various kinds of ecosystem responses to restoration, and these have taken place in the Skagit, Stillaguamish, Snohomish, and Nisqually deltas. And then we've had a variety of analyses and models that have really helped us to do the planning that we do for restoration. And this is our tidal channel allometry model, habitat-specific rearing limitations, that's ongoing, fish response to self-regulating tide gates, sediment transport and delivery, and tidal channel development rates are just some of the projects. Next slide. And then we have a couple of ongoing projects for embayments, specifically looking at fish passage analyses for tidal water crossings and embayment restoration guidelines. So these are just some flavors of the work that we funded. And then just an example of just to show you kind of how we think about the adaptive management cycle. So the learning program is where we have these analyses that can be ecosystem responses and tools to help us plan restoration. The goal is to then communicate these results, reassess, incorporate them into restoration projects, and finally implement them, and then continue learning. And we recognize that we are always trying to evolve the way that we connect the corners of this triangle, as well as improving each component itself. So that's the learning program in a nutshell.
Okay, thanks, Tish. We'll wrap it up here, and then we'll have time for questions. So this is kind of a flow chart that shows how our different programs are all woven together, where we have a variety of teams, peer review teams that all come together to create 4 and actually now 5 individual lists. The Shore Friendly program has a different process where we have 6-year agreements with local shore friendly organizations, and we need to go through a process to develop a budget request and shore friendly package for that program over the next couple of months to also be woven together with this integrated list. We build that list and have what we call it our preliminary investment plan that is in September through RCO that's submitted to the Office of Financial Management and then the governor and then to the legislature. We do some coordination with a variety of different advisory boards, both the Leadership Council, Salmon Recovery Funding Board, and SERP Board. We will present to those. We seek their blessing and input and guidance as we develop our program and our list. And then the legislature makes the final decision on the appropriation. And this is just another small graphic about us weaving together the individual projects, new and portfolio, small grants and learning projects. Go ahead. And please we presented a lot of information here. We are very open and try to be as responsive as possible to working with you. We try to have a very personal approach with the ESRP program. One of the things I did want to mention is this pre-proposal and these quote unquote site visits, these virtual site visits. They're a process meant to, as much as anything else, really support you as project sponsors to make sure that you guys have what you need to have the best application possible within the ESRP program. And we are available to answer your questions as much as we can, particularly now. So that's me and Tish, Kay, and Jeff for small grants and shore friendly.
And just to quickly jump in, Jay, I would just note that at least for me, the phone that's listed there is not the best way to reach me right now because I'm not at the office.
Oh.
So I know you've got a cell phone and so does Kay, but just maybe email is the best way for now, at least.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And go ahead, next slide if there is one. I'm not sure.
No.
That's
No.
it. So let's go ahead and open it up to questions. I don't know, Tish, if you have any chat questions to get us started, if there are any.
No, just the one from Katrinka about match is the only one in the hopper. So if you have a question, it might be best to, if you can, enter it into the chat, or we can try to have people unmute themselves as well. I think we can see how that goes, and if it's feeling overwhelming, we can switch to chat only. So go ahead and unmute or chat a question if you have one. Don't be shy.
We will give it a long uncomfortable silence.
Yeah.
You've left them stunned.
These guys know our program. They're like, yeah, we're old.
Super clear.
Old hats.
Yeah. Feel free to reach out to us if anything occurs to anybody later. Obviously, we're here to answer questions and help.
I'll just give it a minute or two here.
Yep.
The Quaker method of if inspiration strikes.
People are motivated by lunch.
People are motivated by lunch. That's true.
Okay, we've got one from Todd Zaki. Can you use work prior to the grant award as match, specifically for the learning project? So monitoring prior to getting the award. That's a good question. Kay, can you speak to that?
Yeah, we don't have any limitations as far as that goes, as long as it's within your scope of work and directly related. We don't have any criteria for a like length of time or anything, but it just has to be directly related to your scope of work. Tish, would you have anything more to add?
No, I think that sounds great. So we have got a question about just will the presentation be available online for reference? And absolutely, we can post it as well as the recording. Okay, we've got another one. Can you talk a bit more about the focus of the small grants being focused on beaches? Some examples of projects. What if it is a bulkhead removal in front of a former barrier estuary?
Yeah, I would say that the intention of the small grants program was to move forward a body of management actions that we're thinking a lot about that armor removal vital sign, and really trying to think about it's difficult for us to do some of these small actions on our beach system. And knowing that it's not the ecosystem is complex, and so if you have a beachy part of an embayment, let's just talk about that and maybe ask your question, and we can chat about it as a team if you're curious about eligibility for a small project on a part of our embayment system.
Okay, we've got another question similar to Todd's question about using work prior to the grant award as match, but for fully designed and permitted project waiting for funds to construct. Can the design work be used as match?
Yes, it is eligible. The only thing that's not eligible is previous restoration work. So if you've actually started planting or removing armor or any actual construction, that's not eligible. But any prior design work is eligible pre-agreement cost. And I should mention that you can, although you can't match ESRP funds to ESRP funds, you can match other RCO programs to ESRP. So if you completed a final design with surfboard funds or WWRP funds or WICRI funds or anybody other's funds out there, whether they're managed by RCO or anybody else, they would be eligible as match for ESRP. You just can't use the previous ESRP award to match ESRP.
And we do require some non-state match. That could be in-kind, that could be federal, that could be local. We don't have an amount of what that is. It just is some. Okay, any other questions, Tish?
Nope, none, not as of yet, but they're great questions so far, so keep them coming. Okay, let's
I hear
see.
one from Lisa.
Yep, if you opt to use pre-agreement costs such as design for match for construction, this gets added to your total project cost, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
That's a good question.
Okay. Well, maybe we can let folks get to lunch. And if people have questions, they can continue to email us. You actually can call me at that number. I have it forwarded to my email, and then I can get that through my cell phone. But we all will probably better while we're telecommuting to respond to email. And I'm happy to send my cell phone to folks as well. So thank you, everybody.
The number,
oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the number you see there for me, that is my agency cell phone, so I am available through that at any time. So.
Oh, we've got one last question. Will all site visits be virtual, even if the ban is lifted? Like, will we reassess when it gets closer? I think.
Yeah, I think we don't know.
Yeah.
Right now, we have to alter, and then altering back might be difficult.
Mm-hmm. We want to give people the time to prepare for them to be virtual. We love the site visits. We're really bummed to not have them. But yeah, I think we'll take the information as we get it and make a call. But we want to prepare people for the virtual ones.
And I just want to follow up on that is, Surfboard's in the middle of their grant round right now. And so we've been doing regular site visits up until the last 2 weeks, and we've had to switch to webinars. And I've gotten really positive feedback on the webinars that they're, although everybody would obviously prefer to be in the field, in part just to not be in the office. And you get to, see the project straight on. But, if you incorporate some good aerial photos, maybe some drone footage, maybe just some videos of the site, it can really be helpful to get a really good image of the property. And in some cases, it actually provides you more information than if you had just gone out to one small portion of the site. So we found them just, we've only been doing it for these last 2 weeks, but we have found them quite effective. Not ideal, but the best of a bad situation.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for taking their time out of their day. I hope everybody's healthy and safe and doing well. Thank you again, and thanks to Tish and Kay and all of us for putting this together, and we really just appreciate your time and always are excited to work with all of you to support you. That's why we're here, is to do everything we can to support you in your work and keep these important projects going. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.